Today is March the 1st, 2022. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University, and we are in the Angie DeBow room in the library here on the campus in Stillwater. With me is Marty Sargent, who has had a long career at OSU since 1982 and is currently the Senior Associate Athletics Director for Game Day Operations. And we're going to learn a little bit about what that entails in a few minutes. Thank you for joining me. This interview will be part of our project called the We Will Remember Promise. And by way of context, January 27th, 2001, a plane crashed carrying 10 men associated with the Oklahoma State University men's basketball program. In the aftermath, the university and cowboy community made a promise to always remember those lost that day. At the time of the accident, Marty was director of team travel for the athletic department, and since that time has been a key figure in OSU's team travel policies, having served on a team travel task force following the accident, as well as additional committees reviewing and revising the policy. So before we talk about the accident and the promise and the task force, let's learn a little bit about you. Start wherever you like.
Okay. Pleasure to be here. I was born and raised in northwest Iowa. Grew up in a small town called Mobile. It's about 100 miles north of Omaha. My father was a farmer and my mother was a housewife. And I went to school at Woodbury Central at the time and played multiple sports as I grew up. Spent a lot of time there, and my parents, were instrumental in some of the work ethics that I've developed, over time. And when you lived on a farm, you had to work hard, and that's always stayed with me. And I think it's paid a lot of dividends for me because I'm not afraid to go out and work hard, however long it takes. That's what I do. Graduated from high school in 1972, many years ago. Went to Iowa State University, where I walked on the football team there, and Johnny Majors was the head coach at that time, and played my freshman year, then got hurt and couldn't play anymore. And then Earl Bruce came in, started my second year, and was there for for about 4 years. And once I got hurt, he had asked me if what I wanted to do, and I wanted to be a coach, football coach particularly. So I was able to spend a lot of time, in the football office with the coaches, and that was kind of like what they called a student assistant, where I ran a lot of errands, but I got a chance to learn a lot about football and got to meet and work with a lot of coaches there. Many of them, went on to become head coaches, at other colleges, and some of them, went on to become head coaches in the NFL. So I was very fortunate in that regard to be able to spend time with these people and actually learned a lot of football from them. Then when Earl left, he went to Ohio State, and Donnie Duncan became the head coach. And I had graduated then and became a graduate assistant. They called him a part-time coach then, but in essence, it was a graduate assistant position where I got a chance to, again, work with a lot of quality coaches and chance to really learn a lot. And later on in my career, Donnie became very instrumental in some of my beliefs that have developed, because he was, when he went into the Big 12 Conference as one of the associate commissioners for football, he had some very definite ideas about game management, and those built into me what I really wanted to do in that regard, and learned a lot of stuff, and a lot of my beliefs in game management came from Donnie, and so it was a very good time for me, and I learned a lot from Donnie regarding game management, particularly as it's for the players and coaches on the field. because in essence, I kind of view the football field as sacred ground, and go to some pretty extensive measures to try to protect, players and coaches, because, they're not expecting things to happen outside the normal game. And so we did a lot of things, to try to prevent stuff from happening on the field. So then came to Oklahoma State. I got a master's degree at Iowa State in counseling.
In counseling?
Yeah, and I thought it would help me with coaching because, just in dealing with people and players and other folks, I thought that would be helpful for me. And so that's what I got my master's degree in. And then, I couldn't get to where I wanted to go to fast enough in football. And so I decided to get out of football, and that's when I came to Oklahoma State, and I worked in student services here on campus.
Okay.
For a year, and then was fortunate enough to get back into the athletic department here at OSU, because I realized real fast that I wanted to get back into athletics, and I was fortunate enough to do that. And so been here ever since, worn a lot of hats. And the things that I've done did football operations under Pat Jones, and a couple of years with Bob Simmons, dealt a lot with the constructions of the new facilities, particularly with Gallagher in the first phase of football. And, just that got involved in taking bit with the team travel stuff, and dealing with that. And, and then it led into a lot of other things that we'll probably talk about here in a minute.
It's a kind of a curvy path to where you are, but it has turned out well. Yeah. So let's back up a little bit. Back on the farm, were you your only child?
No, I had 3 other brothers. I was the second to the youngest. My older brother, he went to Iowa State. Was a civil engineer there, traveled all over the world in working. He spent a lot of time in China working with the company he worked for, and then he worked all over the United States. So he presently lives in Georgia, in one of the suburbs of Atlanta. I had 2 other brothers, an older one who was a mechanic. He loved cars. And then I had a younger brother that did a variety of things. He worked in a hospital for a while, and then did some odd things after that because there was some unemployment stuff or job losses that happened at that time too. So it worked out, well for them.
So 4 boys. Your mother had her hands full.
Yeah, she was a great cook, and it's just we never lacked food. That's for sure. I mean, we raised our own food. I always tell the story. It's hard. People have a hard time believing this, but until I was in, I think it was 4th grade, we did not have running water in our house. Mm. And so we had an outhouse, had to carry water in. And so didn't think anything of it, because I was little and, just it is what it is. But I know that surprises a lot of people today because they just can't imagine something like that taking place.
So what year would you have gotten running water then?
I was in 4th grade.
So that would have been?
It would probably been
in the
60s. Yeah.
Okay. And what did the farm produce?
My dad raised corn, hay, had cattle and hogs.
So were you a tractor rider early?
Yes, that's how I learned to drive. Was on a tractor. Spent, a lot of time on those tractors working, all day long, out in the fields, preparing for crops and then harvesting the crops. So,
Do you remember your first tractor?
yeah, it was a Super M.
Okay.
It's an international tractor.
And could you plow a straight line?
Sometimes. Sometimes. It, when you're little, sometimes, your version of straight line and your dad's version of straight line is two different things. So,
True. Had your parents gone to college?
No.
No. So you were first generations?
Yeah. My older brother went and I went. My other two didn't go.
So in high school, did you have a favorite subject besides football?
Sports.
Okay, fair enough.
So, I did fine in school.
So what did you major in college for your bachelor's?
Got in physical education.
Physical ed, okay.
Yeah. With a minor in driver's education. And then, because I always wanted to be a football coach.
At the high school level or?
Well, yes, originally I was going to be at the high school level. But once I started working in the football office at Iowa State, I changed my mind real fast.
Okay.
That you get accustomed to some of the benefits, I'll call, of being involved in a Division I football program with the resources that they have to do things. And so, that's just something that I wanted to do. And because I saw that, I felt I'd have a hard time going back to high school to deal with some of the things that I wasn't accustomed, to dealing with.
So what year did you graduate with your bachelor's?
1977.
And then your master's?
Was in 82.
82.
Yeah.
And that's when you came here.
Yes.
Within it. So you finished that before you came to Stillwater.
Yeah.
What was your first impressions of Stillwater and campus?
When I first came here, there wasn't a lot of apartments in town, so it's a struggle to find an apartment. When I first saw campus, I didn't care for the same architectural style, but now I've become very fond of that because I've seen, and Iowa State is one of those, where they have multiple different architectural styles, and I think it really detracts, from a campus, and that's what I like about this campus is it looks the same. The Georgian architectural style. There's a couple buildings that, stretch a little bit from that style, but for the most part, it's all the same, and I think that just adds to the beauty of this campus. Learn real quickly. The people here were very friendly, which was nice, and Iowa State and Oklahoma State they're similar in a number of ways. They're both land-grant institutions, so a lot of similarities between these two schools. And I know that there's a number of people that got degrees from here and went to Iowa State and vice versa. And so there's, I know we've had some people in the department that went to Iowa State and eventually came down here. And so there's a lot of crossover between the two universities because I think they're quite similar, similar sized communities. I think Iowa State's probably a little bigger student population wise than Oklahoma State, but not that much more.
Yeah, they do the howdy.
That and y'all. Yeah.
Have your parents did they come down and visit?
On occasion,
Okay.
My stepfather did. My father passed away in 1986. And so when my mother remarried, she and her new husband, they came down here,
Okay.
several times. So they enjoyed it.
So where do you call home now?
Here's Stillwater.
Stillwater's home.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Been here 40 years, and so it's home, and I always thought, someday when I was younger, would it be nice to go back to Iowa State or someplace like that? But I just, the winters up there are so tough.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go back to that environment.
Okay. I understand that. So about how far is it from here to there?
It's
If you want to drive
it's 550 miles.
Okay.
So it
A
depends
long day's drive.
Yeah, it's a long day's drive. Yeah.
Okay.
Took it many a time.
So when you first moved, where did you end up finding a place to stay?
We stayed out. We stayed out in the Washington Square Apartments,
Okay.
which is on the north side of town, out by the bowling alley, out by the airport. So
Okay.
lived there for a year, and then my wife and I ended up, buying a house here in Stillwater, and moved around and tried to keep moving up in the houses, and like everybody else did. So,
Yep.
And then our son was born in 1986, and he went to Stillwater. And he went to school 1 year here, a year and a half here, and then he started training for long track ice speed skating.
Yep.
And so eventually he moved out to Salt Lake City because that's where they have the Olympic Oval out there. And he went to school at the University of Utah, where he got his business degree from there. And then I forget which Olympics, but he qualified for one of the Olympic trials up in Milwaukee. So got a chance to go up there and watch him do that. So he spent about 5 or 6 years out in Milwaukee, up in Salt Lake City. And just, he started later than what most people do in that profession. And so he felt like he got as far as he could with it, and, it was time to move on. And that's what he did then.
You don't. That's the first time I've heard someone from Stillwater, Oklahoma, interested in ice skating.
Yeah.
He'd have to go to Oklahoma City or Tulsa.
He went to Tulsa.
To the rink.
When he was young, he was a real good inline skater. And so, he was watching stuff when he was younger on TV and said,
"That's pretty cool.
I want to try that." And so he did. And, and we've always, my wife and I, encouraging him to do it, because, you don't want to not try it and then regret it, later on. Because, when you try something like that, the worst thing that can happen to you is I wasn't good enough to make an Olympic team. But there's so many other benefits to trying, where that you tried and things just didn't work out. So he met a lot of great people and got to travel around some. And he's actually on a speed skating committee that he goes to Salt Lake City about one time a year for meetings and that. So it's worked out really well for him.
Yeah, that's neat. And is he your only child?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you moved here. You started in student counseling. That would have been in the student union, probably?
Yeah, it was in Hanner Hall. It was in financial aid.
Okay.
A building that no longer exists.
No longer here. And Cordell Hall, I guess, from being in football, you got used to that being there too.
Yes.
It's no longer here.
Yes.
Yeah,
a lot of changes on campus.
Who hired you for the counseling job?
Charlie Bruce.
I've heard that name.
Yeah, he was here quite a few years. I forget when he retired, but he was here a long time.
And then when you switched to the athletic department, who was the AD at that
It
time?
was Myron Roderick.
Okay. And then for the most of your career, then it was Mike Holder.
Yes.
For the bulk of yours.
Yeah, most of the years it was Mike Holder. Yes.
So go ahead.
And then there was a couple other ones, during that time period. But Mike was here, the longest, and he did a lot of great things here. Particularly, when you look at all these facilities, around here, and he was, instrumental, in that, and in helping the different athletic teams have a chance to be more successful, because, facilities are an important part of that. It's, the campus is the same way. The campus, I always view the campus as buildings, nice buildings and facilities to attract, quality students and faculty, to come here.
Well, I know he was instrumental in Karsten Creek.
Yes, yeah, he built Karsten Creek.
Yeah, and then of course Boone Stadium, Boone Stadium, all of that. So when you first switched over, what were some of the things you would be doing?
Well, I helped start off initially, in dealing some with game management items, and I helped, just because of my background in the financial aid, I helped financial aid with some of the student athletes too, particularly as it related to, like Pell Grants or, student loans and that type of thing, just to get them going down the right path, and then let the people in the financial aid office, do all the things they needed to do. But and I did that for about a year, and then Jimmy Johnson was the head coach when I first came over in athletics, and he was there 1 year, and then ended up going to Miami, and then Pat Jones became the head coach here, and I was fortunate enough to know some people, and I did his football. I was his director of football operations during the time, and that's where I learned a lot, because I got involved in so many different things, with housing and enrollment and just everything to do with all the incoming players and players returning. Did team travel, and so I learned a lot of stuff there, because I got my hands involved in everything of just media, just every aspect of it. So
From those of us who don't know much about operations, I know it takes a lot. So I mean, those little details we just don't think about.
Yeah, because I know when people have never traveled with football, when they travel with us, they're surprised at some of the things that take place, because it's one of those deals, where, and it's right, where people think, well, you just go to the game, play, and come home. And that's true. I mean, that's what's done, but we have to transport them there. There's hotels, play the game. There's buses, there's airplanes, and so there's a lot.
And food.
In food, there's a lot involved in doing all that stuff, because it's when you're moving as many people as we do in football, it takes a lot of organization, and things have to occur in a timely manner to make sure you get all the things done that need to be done.
You have a checklist.
Yes.
About how many travel? Is 100?
Nowadays, there's 70 players that can travel.
Okay.
The staffs are pretty big now, and typically we travel, somewhere around 140 to 150 people.
Okay.
And then there's managers and trainers that, if they can, we bus them there. So
Plus equipment and, I don't know, shoes and uniforms and all that
we
stuff.
have a big semi that we use to transport all that stuff. And we, no matter where we're playing, we'll always truck this stuff. Even when we played out in, California or Florida, we'll truck the equipment there, because it's just too much to put on the airplane.
Okay.
And they have to leave a couple days early, to get out there. And a lot of times, we'll have two drivers where they'll just
Drive straight, take turns.
Yeah, take turns and drive straight through, because, in some cases, it may be a 20-hour trip. And so they've got to get there, and then they've got to be able to get back. So
from your standpoint, which is more involved, an away trip or a home game, or are they about the same?
Well, in recent years, the home games are much more difficult for me, just because of all the game management stuff that I have to deal with. The road games are still, there's a lot to be done with them, but I don't have as much responsibility. I really zero in on the transportation part of it, and so it makes it, a little easier. Still complicated, but it makes it a little easier.
So what is added to your list of to-dos for a home game? Security, I guess?
You got, there's just every aspect of the game. And there's it involves a lot of people. You got security, and you got ticket office people, event staff, medical, maintenance people. And so it's just trying to keep your hands wrapped around that thing to make sure the game functions like it's supposed to. And so there's a lot to do with that. And as time has gone by, it keeps getting more and more complicated because of all the things that we do now to make it a safe environment, try to make it a safe environment for the fans, coming to the game. And so that has definitely changed the dynamics of it. And it with some of the world events, that have taken place, you get some anxious moments, every once in a while, in dealing with something. Something may have happened before a game, and that you have to, potentially react to it and be ready for something.
Yeah, and you switched some rules like clear handbags.
Yes. Yeah. That was started in the NFL and professional sports, and it was done to theoretically to speed up the process and to so you could see what was in that bag, which made it a little easier rather than having to either pull stuff out or there's a period of time where people physically looked in the bag, and with a clear bag that eliminated some of that. So on the surface of it, it helps speed up the I'll call it the check-in process. And people have gotten accustomed to it. We still get some comments about it every once in a while, but there's very few venues that you can go into nowadays that don't have clear bag policies, and I think there's even a few venues that don't allow any bags into the facility. So, and then there's, particularly in professional venues, there's getting to be more and more in college. There's metal detectors that people walk through, and at some point in time, you'll probably see those at almost every venue.
College level too.
Yeah.
Huh?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, how did COVID impact what you did do?
Made it very challenging. One of the things that happened at our medical people, Dr. Ivan and the folks over in Tulsa, OSU Health Sciences, did an incredible job, with that. Very staying on top of it. We did a lot of testing in the fall. Well, when you go back to the spring or to March, we were at the Big 12 basketball tournament, and it was you started to hear more and more about it. We actually had played a game, and then that night, the professional game down with the Thunder, one of the Utah Jazz players tested positive, and that just shut them down. And when that happened, I think everybody felt or had a good idea that the colleges were going to shut down too, just because once the NBA did it, it's going to be in your best interest to do that, and that's what transpired. And what ended up happening is that all the sports for the remainder of the spring were canceled. Mm-hmm. And during that time, there was a lot of unknowns about COVID and how to deal with it. I think there's a lot of us were very concerned about it. because of some of the problems that people were having with it. But our medical folks and the people at ORSU Health Sciences, they developed testing programs, and some of this was done by the conference on how many times you had to test, in football, and particularly that's where it started, in football and soccer. And players, we ended up testing them 3 times a week. Once, I believe it was on Sunday, then on Wednesday, and in football's case, on Wednesday, you had an idea whether you were going to play or not, because if you had a bunch of positive cases, you weren't going to play. And then you did it again on Friday, just to make sure. And then once that was okay, then you were able to play the game. If those that remember it, that during the early summer of 2021, people felt pretty comfortable that we were going to play, and then all of a sudden things started to spike a little bit, and that's when the Pac-10, Pac-12, and the Big Ten said they weren't going to play football, and then the other 3 major conferences, the ACC, SEC, and the Big 12, said they were going to play. And eventually the Pac-12 and the Big Ten played too, but they started quite a bit later in the fall. But we had limited number of people that came into the venues. Ours was about 25%, so we had about roughly 10,000 people in the football stadium. We tried to spread them out to do social distancing. We tried to get people to wear the face mask, but that was difficult to do. The hardest thing with the COVID that first year is you never knew if you're going to play or not. And so we had to do some massive work on changing airplanes around. And it wasn't quite so bad in football, but because you had a good idea. Basketball was very challenging because they played so many games, and you just never knew when you were going to play. There were times where we changed airplanes at the last second, or tried to get them to go to different places. I know our women were up in Ames, Iowa playing, and they were supposed to go to Kansas, but Kansas couldn't play. And so at the last second, the conference said, well, you're going to go to West Virginia to play. So we had to scramble to change airplanes around, to get them out there and back. And so the basketball schedule was much more difficult to do because one, we were indoors and COVID was increasing. Then with basketball and the other sports, we did the same thing with limiting crowds, and we had to do a lot of special things on the floor to keep people, away from players the best we could. Try to social distance on the floor. In basketball, they actually wore devices during practice and games that kept track of contacts they had, or how much time they came in contact with other players and that. And so if somebody tested positive, they could go back and look at the results of that and see who else may have been in contact with that person, where they may have to do some extra checking or check to make sure they didn't have COVID. So it was quite a deal.
Did that prove efficient or not, that aspect?
It did to a certain extent. That was also during a time, where the vaccinations started to roll out, and that helped. Where if you were vaccinated, you were given a little bit more leeway from contact tracing as compared to those that didn't have it, and so it worked. It accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. Okay. I know that both the men and women went to the NCAA basketball tournament. And we got a taste of what was going to happen at that tournament when we went to the Big 12, because we were restricted on the number of people we could take. We could only take 30 total people with us, and they were confined into this bubble area. They had to be tested every day while we were at the Big 12. Everybody was separated by the different teams. All the teams, the men's teams were in the same hotel, and all the women's team were in the same hotel, but they were, on different floors. Everybody had to have their own room. And so there was a lot of stuff that took place there that made it challenging. And then prior to going to the NCAA tournament, we went directly from Kansas City to Indianapolis, in which, we had to have, before we could go there, you had to have, I believe it was 7 days of negative tests. Once we got to Indianapolis, and we had some weather issues to deal with when we left Kansas City, so we got into Indianapolis really late, about midnight. And then when we got to hotel, we had to be tested. When we first got there, we were confined to our rooms. They brought food to us. And then once those results came back, we had to be tested again. And once those results came back, then you could go practice. But we were confined to a hotel the entire time we were there. Indianapolis had a really nice setup because there was a bunch of hotels that connected to a big convention center, in which that's where all the practice facilities, and you literally walked indoors from your hotel to your practice facility. So it worked out better than I thought it would, but it worked out fine. You were confined to your room, and you couldn't go anyplace.
Well, how did the student athletes keep up with their homework during that time? I guess they were virtual.
Well, that, and in cases like that, we travel somebody from the academic center with us.
Okay.
And then they set up times, during the days that, much like they do now, where when we travel on the road, where they spend time with this person from academics to stay on top of, their work, or in some cases, they do the Zoom stuff, and so they did a lot of that stuff. So
I'm just thinking that's something they could do in their room if they're by themselves.
Yes.
Homework.
Yes.
Not most thrilling thing, I guess, but I remember for the basketball arena, they had the seats that you couldn't sit in. They had them
zip tied. Yeah.
Zip tied. Yeah.
We did that just to let people know to try to separate them the best we could, because there was still, at that time, and there was so much unknown about the transmissibility of COVID, and so we ended up doing that. And of course, even today, you still see the sanitizing containers out. You still see some people that are still wearing masks, and I think there'll probably be people that will always do that now. But I was glad, when some of this stuff relaxed a little bit, where you didn't have to wear a mask, and you could kind of try to get back to somewhat normal the best you could.
Listening to what all you do, I can't imagine it's a 40-hour-a-week job.
It's not.
No.
It's not.
On a home game day, how early do you get to campus?
I get here at the latest 6 o'clock in the morning.
And stay until?
If it's a night game, I probably will get home, depending on what time the game starts, 11, 12, 1 o'clock.
A long day.
Yeah. And so there's just so many things that take place where you start checking things to make sure everything's set up in the way you want it to be set up, and then just start checking stuff and rechecking.
And during the game, are you watching the game, or are you still doing all this other things?
I'm actually in the police command post, in which we're monitoring the game for a variety of things. If the most logical thing is going to be weather. And we have a meteorologist that's up in the command post with us, where he is extremely helpful, particularly if weather might be an issue, where you can stay on top of it to have a good idea what's going to take place, because you have potentially 60,000 people that could be impacted by weather, whether it's lightning or severe storm or worse. So that's one of the things we spend a lot of time on in preparing for is severe weather, because that's the most logical thing to happen is severe weather in this state.
Especially in football season.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I know this is a little bit off subject, but I remember this was 2011, I think the game day was here and the earthquake happened. And that's something I guess you have to worry about too during those peaks and spikes that we have in activity.
Yeah, because it most of the time, as people know, you really don't feel when there's an earthquake, but sometimes you do. Because I know we had one that was in the morning of a game that, was pretty big, and, it caused some damage, when it rattled. I mean, some bricks in that on buildings and campus and that fell down. And we had to check everything as best we could to make sure it was safe for people, to come back into it. But in most cases during a football game, people, you're not going to feel it, just because there's so many people and it's so noisy that you're not going to feel it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I'm thinking all of this, a lot of this you're learning on the job as things come up too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Before we get into the plane crash, then let's talk a little bit about 2015 when the homecoming parade thing happened. I'm sure that impacted some of what you were doing that
did,
afternoon.
That morning, I started hearing about it over the radio that something had happened down there. And when that happened, some of the initial discussions were they were going to land helicopters on the grass practice fields that were east of Gallagher. And at that time, our band was out there practicing, and we chased them away in case the helicopters did land there, because they were going to bring a lot of helicopters in because there's a lot of people that got hurt. But they eventually decided to land them down on the street in the area. And so from that aspect of it, it didn't impact us a lot, but the thing that it did do was, there was a great concern about the people that were hurt, and in some cases, some people that died from it. But one of the first things we had to happen is, because of this, a decision had to be made on whether we were going to play the game or not. Mm-hmm. And so, the athletic director, Mike Holder, and that got in touch with the conference office, and a discussion occurred on, were we going to play the game or not. Television, everybody got involved in it, but the decision was made to play the game. And I always thought that was the right decision to do, because the football game provided people an opportunity to, release their emotions and be able to think about something else for a couple hours rather than what had happened down in the parade accident. And so that decision was made. And then, the next thing that came into mind was this an isolated incident, or was there something else going to occur at the game? And so we had to make some preparations, for that. And then there's a lot of traffic, on game day and how that may or may not impact the game. More so probably after the game with post-game traffic and that. But it worked out. We were monitoring it throughout the game, and eventually, they opened the streets, back up to let us do the post-game traffic, because it took so long, because when that accident occurred, it became a crime scene. Mm. And so they had to gather all the information and evidence that they needed, for that. And that took a long time to do. Like I said, eventually it cleared back up or they opened the streets back up before the end of the game, which that helped us from that standpoint. But we were having to make plans in case it wasn't, and how were you going to direct people, to leave the stadium.
So game day traffic before and after is part of your...
Get involved, yes.
Yeah.
We have. I said there's a lot of people.
A lot of different things.
Yeah, there's a lot of people involved, in this, from the athletic department, the university, the city, and the state. All get involved in this.
And at that point, I guess the Emergency Operations Center was
Activated.
Operating at that point too.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just, it's. You hope nothing like that happens, but that's what you prepare for, or try to prepare for, is the unknowns that could happen. And during the summer months, we spend a lot of time with different agencies, local, state, and federal agencies, in trying to plan for incidences that could occur, within the stadium. And like I said, the most logical one is weather, but then it goes off in all kinds of categories, after that.
Lots of crisis management, preemptive crisis management too. Okay, well then let's transition into January 27th, 2001. Okay. Take us through that day for you. Were you with the team?
No.
Okay.
I wasn't. It was a normal trip, going out there, and then coming back. And you have to excuse me, this is still...
I know, that's fine. Take a break if you need to. Do you normally travel? Did you normally travel with the team?
I traveled some with them.
Okay.
Football,
travel.
I travel football all the time.
Okay.
And with basketball, I travel with them on occasion.
Okay.
The night or the afternoon of the accident, word started getting out that something had happened. Mm-hmm. And eventually, I was getting a lot of phone calls. And eventually I called Gary Johnson out the airport and asked him if he knew what was going on. He said there had been a plane crash. And so, and they were just trying to account for who was on that airplane. Because at the time the team came back on 3 airplanes. And of course, 2 of them made them back safely and 1 didn't. And so, once they knew who was on the airplane, then, Coach Sutton called every one of their families and told them what had happened. And later that night, it was, the athletic department met, or this administrative staff met, and different administrators we worked with the families of the victims of this plane crash. And then, eventually, I know I worked with Pat Noyes' family. And, when this is no doubt probably the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with, bar none. And I know that I kind of get this from my dad, but when something bad happens, I always try to find something positive about it. And the one positive I got out of this is when I met a great family. And I knew Pat beforehand, and that's why I wanted to work with his family. But they're an incredible family. To this day, I still stay in touch with them. And so that's the one thing that helped get through this, because that's the positive thing that I got from this, and it helped me to deal with it, because we went through some really difficult times, very difficult times. I can't imagine what it's like, for a parent to lose a child, in this case, in an airplane crash. Can't imagine that. I mean, unless you dealt with something like that, you can't imagine what it's like. People's emotions were very raw, and it was a difficult time for athletics, the university, and even the state. It was a tough time, very tough time.
And then at some point you had to start planning. Well, did you help? As the event management type of thing? Did you memorial service
I got involved in
first
that.
biggest event?
I got involved in that a little bit. There were some other people that dealt more with that. The folks in athletics that worked with the families, I mean, they really zeroed in on the families.
Okay.
And that's where they spent all their time and energy, with, is to help the families the best they could, to try to work through all the things that had to be worked through, on this situation. And so that's how people, spent their time was with that, because there's different people assigned different, I'll call them, things to get done in order for all this stuff to take place.
And I had to help them through the memorial service, and then I guess the dedication service in Colorado.
Yeah. That was that was a difficult deal to do, because when you went there, the memorial was all done, but you physically saw where the airplane crash occurred, and there was a marker there where it actually occurred. And so, you just go, wow, that's where this thing took place. And it was a tough deal, because a lot of things came back into your mind, about that evening and what had taken place.
Do you remember anything in particular about the dedication?
It was a chance where families and athletic staff and that got a chance to get together, because a lot of people went to Colorado to be a part of it. And so I remember that, and it was kind of a situation where, when we first went out there, if my memory's right, is that it was cloudy, kind of dreary, cool day, and then once the event took place and it was over, then all of a sudden the sun came out. So
it's interesting. Yes. And it was the town of the community of Strasburg.
Yeah, they were there.
They were there.
Yeah, they were. I didn't have much dealing with that, but they played a vital role, in that, in responding to the accident, and then just, trying to do whatever they could, to help people deal with this.
I think that was like in August. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, yeah.
And then 9/11 happened.
Yes.
And then in October, if I've done my research correctly, is about when the task force started up.
Yeah,
the end of October of.
Yeah, it started the following year after the airplane crash.
So you're like, okay.
Yeah, the initial one did, and that task force was made up of people from the university, the community. There were some aviation experts that came in. We had student athletes that were on it, and there were a couple of family members, were on this committee, in which a review was done of team travel, and the things that needed to be looked at when trying to set up travel. Looked at airplanes, buses, vans, just all kinds of transportation. And out of this task force, what developed was, one, the university hired an aviation consultant in which this person reviewed airplanes, primarily what I call private aircraft, to make sure they meet certain standards that we're wanting to see. And then there's also guidelines, procedures regarding vehicle travel, whether it's by van or by bus, in which those things were put into place. And that's where the things, when student athletes travel for team travel, that stuff was checked to make sure that we tried to cross our T's and dot our I's on it.
Keeping the student athletes safer, or as best you could, was the key to all of that.
Yes. Yeah.
I read that there was like 16 or 17 people.
Yeah, it was a pretty good sized committee, yes.
Yeah. And 3 of the fathers
Yes.
were on it. So
Mm-hmm.
do you think that working through that process helped them, or as a in general, to work through some of that?
Yeah, I think it probably helped everybody, but I think it was viewed at that some things were put into place to try to make travel safer for student athletes. Because with the first policy and procedures for team travel, it was set up specifically for student athletes, in which when they traveled, that these requirements had to take place. So I think the people on this committee felt good that some things were put into place to try to help ensure the best we could that things were safer for them traveling, knowing that even with all these things in place, you could still have an accident. Because I know that when I look back on that, if somebody would have told me there's going to be an accident, I thought it would be like a van or something like that, not an airplane. So
I know in 1970 was when the Wichita State team,
right.
You would have still been in high school at that
Yes,
point.
yeah,
And Marshall, I think, was that same
yes.
year. And he just wondered if other universities looked at their aviation travel things at that point and made adjustments.
Well, I know that after ours happened earlier, I forget when it was, Iowa State actually had some track people that were killed in an airplane crash. I think there was only a couple of them, but I know that we contacted them to see what some of the things they did in that regard. But I think what happens, and you see it all the time, is people never think it's going to happen to them. It's human nature that to think that something like this is going to happen. You just don't. That's not going to happen to me. Well, in our case, it did. Out of that, there were positive things that came out of it. And with that, not only for our department, but a lot of other institutions looked at it And I think a lot of people modified some of their travel stuff to help their student athletes. Because ours was pretty strict. And I think some other people weren't quite as strict as ours, but we felt we needed to do that. And as time went along, some of those have been modified to, like with airplanes, that some terminology had changed and some FAA stuff had changed. And so we modified some of that stuff. And even, with the vans, initially, because during that time period, the vans were, when you put too many people in them or put too much weight, they had a tendency to roll. They rolled over easier. And so we limited the number of people that could go into the vans. And then eventually the vans became better. And some of that stuff has changed now where, we can put in these vans, however many seat belts there are, that's how many people can go in. Whereas originally it was limited on the number of people that could be put in these vans.
So you touch this policy every couple of years to make sure things are review it and update it or whatever.
Yeah. We can do it every year if we want to. In some cases, that's not necessary because if we're satisfied that the policy is working like it's supposed to, then we don't make any changes to it. But if there's something occurs that we need to look at something, and then that's what we'll do. And then we run that up the chain of command to see what kind of feedback we get. And then eventually it goes to the Board of Regents for their approval or not.
All that process can
Takes time.
6 months or a year or
It
so.
takes time. Yeah.
And then the one that OSU put forth that you're a part of, what were some of your tasks? Were you assigned any?
Well, just to help gather information about how much like vans we use and how often we got on private airplanes as compared to the bigger airplanes, that type of thing, and just be a resource person for how things had been set up, in the department.
Did someone on the committee survey the other Big 12?
Yeah, there were some surveys done to see what other institutions across the country were doing. Some were doing some, but a lot of people, from what I remember, didn't have a lot of stuff in place, regarding this stuff because, private airplanes was kind of a somewhat new thing as far as transporting student athletes and that, because a lot of times they end up flying commercially. And so a lot of them were still doing it so there were some things that didn't apply, but as time went along, more and more people started flying on charters and private airplanes. And so there's more things that need to be put into place to try to make sure that these folks are getting on safe airplanes.
So I guess I've skimmed through the policies. Some of it applies to pilot training, plane maintenance, weights and balances.
Well, the aviation consultant, what he does is that he looks at the policies, and then applies them to these private aircraft to make sure that they are meeting, the pilots they're doing the necessary thing they're doing as far as training. They've got all their certificates up to date, the number of hours they are flying on that specific airplane, and just overall total hours of flying, the maintenance and upkeep of the aircraft, and then the insurance on the airplane.
So part of it was accountability and responsibility.
Yes.
Put someone in charge of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and this person, works outside the athletic department. And so, I spend quite a bit of time with John in getting him information and who we might be used or who we'd like to use for some of these private aircraft, and where he can check them to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And most of the airplanes that we use nowadays for private ones are corporate airplanes, in which, the vast majority of those, they do a really good job of keeping the airplane up and insurance and training and playing, because, they're flying around CEOs of major corporations. And so they're wanting to make sure that individual is getting on a safe airplane too.
Part of that is the insurance aspect. Was that a part of the discussion for the task force?
Yes.
That's part of it.
And insurance is, we came up with some numbers. Insurance is a pretty volatile industry, in which in some cases, it's hard to meet some of those original requirements. And that's why there's some give and take with some of that stuff, in all the stuff with the approval process of these airplanes, because there's some, like I said, insurance is one where sometimes it's difficult to meet that type of insurance.
So from your standpoint, do you personally have to be familiar with the NCAA travel rules and the state legislative, whatever the state laws might be for that sort of thing?
Well, with NCAA stuff, our compliance people,
Okay.
they
do
deal with that part of it.
Okay.
What I look at is, are we meeting the team travel guidelines? That's what I look at, and actually sign off on the travel voucher that they meet the approval with it. There's been times where exceptions can be granted to this process, but I know we've had some with airplanes where a pilot may not have the exact number of hours that we'd like to see, but he or she's close enough, and they have enough other hours that we feel comfortable. And John makes that decision if he feels comfortable or not, and then he runs it up the chain of command to get the university to okay it.
Okay. So there's procedures in place that you have to
Yes.
pass for all that.
Yes.
Part of accountability, I
Yes.
guess, was part of
Yes.
that too. And then some things changed to the policy after the 2011.
Yeah, because in the original policy, it was specifically for student athletes, and coaches and staff made their own decisions on whether or not they were going to get on an airplane. And after the crash in 2011, that was changed, where staff, if they're going to fly on a private aircraft, that airplane has to be approved by our aviation consultant, in which he, again, is looking at, do the pilots have the training we're wanting? Do they have the hours? Do they have the certificates that we're wanting? Is the plane being maintained properly? And he looks at all that stuff, and then says yes or no to them. And again, most of the airplanes that we have utilized on occasion, where the owners of these airplanes, let us do that, is that they're corporate, big time corporate airplanes, and so they are doing the things they need to do to maintain these airplanes. Just again, because their CEO of a major corporation is riding on this airplane. These people have these airplanes for a reason, and is part of their business, and they're flying all over the country or all around the world in these airplanes because it saves them a whole bunch of time. I mean, you can just think that when you fly commercially, that you have to get to the airport hour and a half before it's scheduled. Then you have your flight, and just and it takes you hours to do it. Well, people that have these airplanes, they arrive at the airport. 10 minutes later on the airplane, they're leaving. And so they save an immense amount of time because their time is extremely valuable. And that's why they have these airplanes.
And part of the decision to use charter planes is if the students need to get back
Yes.
for class or
Yeah.
whatever that
Yeah.
versus commercial.
Yes, because it, say like for example, later today, the men's basketball team is flying to Iowa. If we were to fly commercially, it would take us all day to get there, and then we couldn't leave after the game because we couldn't get back, and so it would be Sunday before we came back, and then it's going to take us all day to get back. And so on these charters is that, we'll show up at the airport. An hour later, we're in Des Moines, Iowa, play the game, and then come back. And then, once we get to the airport, an hour later, we're home. And so there's an immense amount of time saved, in which it helps everybody because now they're able to, the students aren't as missing as much class, and people, are getting back home in a timely manner.
So one of the biggest changes from the task force, the first task force, was that student athletes could not fly on donated planes.
That's
Does that sound right?
well, they can under certain circumstances.
Okay.
What takes place here is that the university actually has 3 travel policies. It's got team travel, employee, and student travel.
Okay.
And the team travel one is probably the most restrictive one, or the most involved with it. But they're all 3 similar in a lot of ways, particularly when it comes to vehicle travel and with private aircraft. The policies for employee team travel are very similar, where it has to be approved by the aviation consultant. And in the original team travel policy and in the current one, there are exceptions where student athletes can get on these private airplanes. But it's very restrictive on the type of airplane that they can get on. And we go through that process of getting those approved by our aviation consultant.
Okay. So 3 different policies now. Okay.
And I don't know, did one lead to the other one, or were they always there? I'm not sure of that. I'm sure there was some form of it there, but I know that over time, the university has looked at all 3 and tried to make them similar or consistent in how, the university may want, what requirements they want people to follow.
Following the conclusion of the first task force that you were on, they did a final report, I'm assuming, with it, and then the regents had to approve it.
Yes.
And then how did, like, new staff people coming on in the athletic department, would they have to, how are they made aware of it? Let's put it that way.
In the policy, it's very specific that coaches need to sign off on this every year. And that's something that I do, is to go around to the different sports and talk to them about it, in which they sign off on it. In some cases, some of the sports, somebody like I visit with like the director of operations of the sport and say, these are the things I need them to know, and then I have them do it. Because their time is, it's hard to tie them down to do some things, so it works out easier for that. But I do that with a couple of sports, but most sports I specifically sit down with them and have them sign off on it.
Okay. So that's one on your to-do list.
Yes. Yeah.
Once a year? Or,
yes, once a year.
Or when someone new comes on?
I do it in the summertime.
In the summer when things are a little slower?
Yeah, right before the start of the school year, we try to hit them all.
Yeah. When is the slowest time for someone in your position? Or is there one?
There isn't any.
There isn't one.
No, it's because the athlete teams aren't finished competing, until sometime in June, hopefully sometime in June, and by that time we've already started gear back up for football, getting ready for football, because it takes a lot of preparation, for football to plan for it and get everything put in place.
Okay, let's switch gears just a little bit. Then you said you were involved with the renovations of the stadium and the arena. Anything that stick out in your mind, those two projects?
Well, I had no technical training in that, so it was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. But I'm very logical and hopefully have a lot of common sense. So from that standpoint, it made it, a little easier to try to understand some of this. When with some of the technical stuff, to this day, I have no idea what they're talking about. But I think that, going through this process, you learn a lot about construction, all the things that have to take place for construction to build a facility, and all the planning and all the work that takes place before you put a first shovel into the ground. With drawings and all the meetings that take place in order for the architects to gather the information what the owner of that facility wants to see in that building. And I think that was the biggest thing. And because I thought, particularly with Gallagher, that I thought that the architects had some software program that said just build it, but that's not how it works. Now they have some stuff that help them draw all these drawings and that, but as far as you still have to look for problem areas that are in these drawings, and that's why it takes so many people from not the construction companies but from the university and other people just say, is this going to work like we envision it is going to work? Is the light switch in the right place? Does the door open the right way? And so there's a lot of stuff that takes place.
Any surprises that they did and it didn't work?
I think anytime that you build massive buildings or big buildings, you think you make the right decision on something, but after it's built, or you get into it, you say, well, that it didn't work kind of like we thought it was going to. Or even as you're building it, you discover things that you've left out, or you want to change because it's not going to work like you thought it was. So, and that's going to occur, all the time.
Well, in the football stadium, is there something that you think they should have, you wished you had done differently? Any one thing? It looks great to me, but
I think it was, I think there's always things that you would like to have done differently, but I mean, it's the football stadium and even Gallagher, they're incredible structures. And, you know, when people see them, they go, wow, this is really nice. And so, I mean, says a lot about the design of the facility and the use of the facility. And particularly when you look at it from the standpoint of what the football stadium used to look like.
Yep.
And if people weren't around, then they have no idea what it looked like and all the weaknesses or pitfalls of that stadium. Because when you look at it now, I mean, even today when I say, I go, wow, this is a nice facility.
I'm thankful for the escalators in Gallagher.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, original designs for it did not. What was going to be in the lobby where the memorial is? Was it just going to be open space?
It was just open space.
Open space.
You know, in some of the original thinking that lobby where the memorial is and the lobby where the Pistol Pete statue is, at one time, we were going to put parts of Heritage Hall in there, the Hall of Fame. And that's why when you look at the floor in those areas, you see all the outlets that are in the floor. And that's why they were there, because we were going to put some of Heritage Hall and really expand it out. But in the end, we decided not to do that. So.
Okay. Well, the memorial's in a nice place.
Yes,
I think.
very visible.
Were you present when they dedicated it?
Yes.
For that?
Yeah.
And each year they do the anniversary. It's gotten less formal through the years at the request of the families, from what I understand.
Yeah. You know, we still try to do something, you know, every year,
Acknowledge it.
just to acknowledge it, and for the families to know that we're still thinking of them, and you know, that promise that was made that we won't forget.
Yeah.
And
President Halligan that
Yes.
night in the memorial said,
Yeah.
"Let us vow to never forget." Well, how do you think OSU's done on keeping that promise?
I mean, I think the university and the athletics has done a good job with it, because people, you know, that, you know, have been involved in that, you know, have stayed in touch with some of the family members. Some of the people that were assigned families don't work in the athletic department anymore, but, you know, if there were scholarships that were developed because of an individual, that there's people that have worked with them and have stayed in touch with them, you know, about that. I know that in my case that I try to stay in touch with the Noyes family. And I think I missed them. Some of them were here when we did that for that basketball game a few weeks ago, but I was traveling with the women, so I didn't get a chance to see them. But you know, when they do come here, I get a chance to visit with them, and I do call them.
And then some of them come for Remember the 10 run,
yes,
for the run.
Yeah.
And that came about, I think, 2007, something
Somewhere
like
around,
that.
I forget the time, but
Yeah.
it's really a neat event. You know, it raises quite a bit of money, and you know, you see a lot of the families, you know, that come back for it. And I think it's important to them, and well, I know it is.
It's a positive
Yes.
thing too for
Yeah.
them. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you remember about Pat? I mean,
You know,
or do you don't have to. If you don't.
I don't want to
Oh, that's fine.
go into that because it's too much of a.
Okay, then I have to ask you about, did you know Henry Abbott?
Yes, I did. I met him on a couple of occasions. Did he know me? No. But I was here when he was here. You know, and I, you know, remember, you know, people talking to him and talking about him, and all the things that Mr. Iva did for basketball and the university. And the floor in Gallagher is still the original floor to Gallagher. And so he was there.
I think it has a chair that's his, or
Yeah, it's up in the concourse level.
is it still there?
Yeah.
I haven't walked around that way to see.
Yeah, it's still there.
I thought you might have at least met him.
Yeah. He came to football practice because Pat spent quite a bit of time with him trying to learn some things from him. So
And it was Mr. Iva, not Coach Iva. It was Mr.
yes,
Iva.
Mr.
wasn't
Iva.
it?
There's only a few people that some very close friends calling him Hank, but and I always thought that anybody else that didn't call him Mr. Iva didn't know him. Because everybody knew him calling him Mr. Iva.
Well, then was Eddie, or was Eddie Coach Sutton or Coach Eddie or
I call him Coach Sutton.
Coach Sutton?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I had somebody tell me this one time about another coach he worked with, but Coach Sutton was the type of person that you didn't want to disappoint. And he was an incredible coach, incredible person. The little things that he did for people was just incredible. Because I remember a couple occasions where I was with him at an NCAA basketball tournament and we were walking, it was in Indianapolis, and we were walking down a marshalling area, and there was an event staff person there. I asked him, he said, "Coach, should I take your picture?" And he said, "Sure." And he grabbed the guy's camera, gave it to me, he put his arm around him, and I took the picture. And that's what he does. That's what he did all the time. Because a lot of coaches wouldn't have done it, or they'd said, "Yeah, go ahead and take the picture." But he took 10 extra seconds to make an impression on that person that person will never forget. And that's what he was so good about. He was just incredible with that.
Did his approach change after the crash, or was he like that before?
He was like that before.
Before.
He was always like that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I got a funny story I always tell about Coach Sutton is that when we were started renovating Gallagher, Bill Clinton was the president of the United States, and of course Coach Sutton knew him very well because of the days at Arkansas. And we were getting ready to try to close down or move people out of Gallagher to temporary offices because we were going to come in and renovate the building. Well, with Coach, he said, "Well, I need to stay in here until after the basketball season." "We can do that, Coach. That's not a problem." And it just kept going, extending farther and farther. And then one time, Manhattan was a contractor, and they said, "Well, why can't you get him out of the building?" And I go, it's one of my all-time great lines, said, "Will the President of the United States take a phone call from you?" They said, "No." I said, "He will from Coach Sutton." And they never said another word to me. We eventually got Coach out, but I had so much respect for Coach Sutton, the job that he did and how he dealt with people and how he made players better as they grew within his program. He just did an incredible job, and his success. All you gotta do is look at his success to that. I enjoyed, being around him because he did little things that most people don't do.
I know we took our son to his basketball camps several years, and you saw a different side of him when he was on the court.
Yes.
But when he stepped off of it, it was different too. So.
Yeah. He was of course, he played for Mr. Iva and learned a lot of some of his beliefs came from Mr. Iva. But, the thing that Coach Sutton did was, he changed with time, particularly as, it relates to dealing with players and that, and staff and that. And a lot of things he did, you would do anytime, but he had the ability, to change and adapt to, things that were taking place as he went along in his coaching career.
Well, any funny stories about him that any come to mind?
Well, not so much, funny ones, just more out of respect for what he did, because I know that when my son was growing up, they had ball boys that worked the games by the basketball goals, and I was in. Tony had gotten a bunch of autographs from players, but he didn't have Coach Sutton, so I went to Coach, can you sign this? And he said, sure. And he said, we need to have your son be one of our ball boys. And it's just, it's stuff like that. That's what he did. And he was so good about. And so many people will, they'd love to help him because they knew that he cared and about them, and so people wanted to help him.
He was a people person.
Yeah, it was very much so.
So that night was really tough on him. That whole
very tough.
From that point on was tough. I guess not just that one night, but
it was very tough on him.
Very tough.
And I think Patsy she helped him, immensely through that process.
Okay. So and then I know that the library does the bells at the time for that. So they've got that going on. So that's one way to help remember them as well. So I'm gonna check my questions real quick. Is there anything else that you need to talk about that I don't know to ask about?
I don't think so.
Did you know Coach Budke?
Yes.
Do you want to say anything about him or?
That was.
He wore the orange coat. He was the one for the orange coat.
Yeah. I know that I spent some time with him. When I traveled with him. Some of the NCAA tournaments and that, but I'll never forget that night that I was up in the football team was up in Iowa getting ready for a game, and I had been up late, doing some work to get ready to go home the next day, and then, all of a sudden, like at midnight or 12, I forget somewhere between midnight and 1 o'clock, I get a phone call from Mike Robinson, and I go, this isn't good. And I thought maybe originally something happened to my parents. But he started asking questions about did I know if Kurt and them had gone on an airplane trip. And I said, yeah, they left that day to go recruiting on to Arkansas. And then he said there had been a crash. And then I got a hold of Mike Holder because he was on the trip. And of course, then we were up all night trying to start to make preparations and that. And the hard thing was that, we played at night that next night up in Ames. And all day long, everybody, just all they heard was about this crash. It was on sports, and that's all they heard all day. And of course, they knew a lot of some of the basketball players. And so it was a tough day.
He did wear the orange jacket just for
OU.
Just the OU game.
Yeah.
And Coach Boynton had it on his last OU game. The one thing I didn't back up and ask about is when after the crash, the athletic department itself started a task force to talk about travel.
Well, it was all in just, making sure that people were aware of the policies and how
Okay.
they're being implemented,
Okay.
on that.
I kind of thought maybe it was one of those times where you just step back and assess your procedures and see what needed changing and that sort of thing.
Well, that does occur, and sometimes, the athletic director may want to make some recommendations or to review something, or the aviation consultant may say, this needs to be updated, or even the university may have some things.
And then when the university started theirs, it just kind of morphed and let them do the bigger policy.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then if there's nothing else you think we need to talk about, my last question is, how do you want people to remember Marty Sargent?
Well, it is somebody that loved this university, dedicated his life to it, and always tried to do what was best for student athletes and for the department. And in some of those cases, that may not have been a popular decision. Or a thought process, but I think that one of the most important things to me has been and always will be is when I get feedback from people and or players that, hey, thank you for everything you did for me, and that means the world to me.
Okay. Well, then before we got started, you said you're retiring soon.
Yeah, I'm going to retire June 1st after 40 years here. And then take some time off and then come back and, combination of working part-time and being a resource person for another year or so, and then, eventually walk away and let somebody else deal with it and try to, this past year I've been trying to help some people and, go through the process and give them some responsibilities to do some things. And then hopefully I'll be able to slow down a little bit, and then I've got 2 new granddaughters that be able to spend some time with them, because I can't do it now.
And maybe go to a game where you're an actual fan in the stands.
I don't know if I'll ever sit in the stands. I'll have a hard time because I've trained myself, to try to be observant and see what things going on, and I always tell people, I can't even go to church without looking around and watching people to a certain extent, and so that'll be hard to get out of that mode, because I've done it for so long, and just kind of trained myself to be observant of what's going on in your surroundings. And it's one of those deals I always tell people that it not only applies to athletics, but just in your general life. You need to be observant of what's going around you, and I think most people, or a lot of people, would be surprised if they are that way, what they might really see.
Well, you'll still be around to mentor
Yes.
a person or two,
Yes.
maybe.
Yes.
Well, I know OSU is thankful that you came down the interstate from Iowa and are now calling Stillwater home. So
It it's been an incredible experience here. I've gotten to do things that I never imagined that I'd be able to do. I've met all kinds of people. My son got to experience some things that most kids don't know even exist. And that was to me, that was really important for him to be able to see that. But I think it's just, the people that I've met and had a chance to work with. And it's just, those are some of the things that I'll remember the most.
Okay. And you have a closet full of orange?
Yep.
Okay.
That and, we've been very fortunate to, to go to a lot of bowl games and NCAA travel, so I've got a lot of stuff from all that. And of course, there's a lot of war stories.
So I'm thinking of all the basketball and football coaches that you've known. Have you had them sign a ball?
In some cases I have, but in a lot of cases, I don't. I have not done that because I can say that I know them, and I got some pictures. There may be some pictures that I have, but
Probably the most famous one of those would have been Jimmy Johnson. Famous.
Yeah, he's gone on. I mean, he was very successful.
Johnny Majors,
Johnny Majors was always
great at Tennessee.
Yeah, he won a national championship at Pittsburgh. But I always said with Johnny Majors, he could say in the Mojave Desert, and you thought you got a good deal. But with some of the football people, I was part of staff that Pete Carroll was on, who's presently the head coach of up in Seattle. Had a chance to work with Mac Brown, and the list goes, on and on of people that I've come across that have had an influence on how I view things. So, which was really, really, really a valuable deal to be able to say to fall in their experiences and pick up some things from them. So,
And be open to picking it up.
Yes,
One of the keys too. Okay, well then, thank you very much for sharing with us. It's been great.
Yeah, it's these years have gone by fast, and it's hard to believe that I've spent 40 years here already, because I can vividly remember some things when I first started here. So, but there's no question there's some things that stand out.
Well, I know campus is much prettier today than it was.
Yes, it's changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of new buildings, and there's been major push on, I'll call it, beautification of the campus, and because I get to travel quite a bit and I see campuses, and this one ranks as one of the better ones. And
now they're adding statues around the football stadium.
Yes.
Do you know what the next one's going to be? No.
Not yet, no.
Not Marty, huh?
No, that won't happen.
All right, then we'll close. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.